Hello all, Siso is here bringing you a video on my latest creation. As you can see here, I have a hovering robot, that has a couple of jets connected. Now, most of this is fairly simple. I can hold Q, and it will go up, E will go down, W goes forward, S doesn't go backwards because jets can't provide backwards propulsion. However, if I hit A, turns to the left, D, turns to the right. And, some of you might be noticing the massive plasma cannon on the bottom. If I click X, it starts to fire as fast as I can get it to fire with 2 flux capacitors. Now, the original plan for this particular design was to use the lasers off there in the distance and put them on the middle and have it so that when you clicked X, it would drop the whole bot straight down into the ground, turning on the laser while it did it. I did originally test that idea. However, it turns out that laser swords are solid. So when you hit the ground, it messes up the angle that you're falling at, and you can actually like balance on it and stuff. It's not what I wanted for my drop pod here. So now I've got instead a very small, lightweight bomber that's, if I had more flux capacitors, I would put them on the front and the back and link them up to make the cannon fire faster, because there is a maximum speed for which flux capacitors can charge. I believe. I have not done extensive testing on that, but I'm fairly certain that is the case. If I'm right, I think it's about 4 charges per second, which is why if I open up the code for this, for the gun that is, there are 3 sections of code for this, you'll see that I have a frequency of 8, because that's 8 shots per second, because I have 2 flux capacitors. The idea was to try and get them to fire roughly between each other, instead of, if you turn that up too high, it'll just fire 2 every time it fires. I didn't like that idea. You'll also note the camera. It's on the front, there's no code connected to the camera. It's just sitting there so that when I'm flying, I can see the direction that I'm firing. Because the idea for this is to fly up as high as possible and be completely unaffected by the arc of the cannon, because it's firing straight down, so gravity can't modify it. So this invention I've called the drop pod bomber, or the bomber drop pod, something like that, something to that effect. And it's created from 3 codes. Obviously, I've shown you the flux capacitor code. I'll explain this in a minute. There's also the hover code. Now, this hover code, this part here, and which is mirrored here on the right, and these top 2 sections up here, is all just the left side of my balance system, and you can check out the unicycle video if you want a more lengthy explanation on that. However, what I did was I swapped the right side, instead of being, as it was in the balance tutorial, the jet on the other side, or in this case the hover, I've replaced it with the with an input sampler that stores up an altitude that I want to balance it against. So basically, instead of balancing against the relative against the position, the altitude of the other piece on the other side of the bot, this time it is balancing against an altitude, so it's trying to reach that altitude no matter what happens. Now, to this end, I've got down here input sampler, Q and E, I made them binary just because I didn't like it speeding up. That's why the attack and release is so high. At this point, it'll always be either 1 or 0. Or 1, 0 or negative 1. Now this part here, which I'll move so that it's easier to see, there we go, up in space, is an input is a sample mapper. Turns the -1 to 1 that you get from this input sampler and makes them into -5, 0.5 to 0.5. These values were actually chosen to because I found out if you have those too high, it will flip. It's not perfectly weighted. I don't think it's actually possible to perfectly weight it. I think it's got something to do with the fact that the jets pull out more to the back side than they do to the front. Right, so the center of balance is slightly to the back. That's probably the case, and it's just something you're going to have to deal with. Anyway, up here we've just got, this is the controller, this is the part where it sets it. Basically, in set point, I originally set a value for this bot, it was 2000, so every time it loads, set point is 2000. 2000 is, I believe, the water level. Of the lab at least, it might be the water level in general. Then I set KP to 1, and I put in the input sampler here inverted so that what happens is when you hold Q, it goes to it puts 1 in here, turns that to 0.5, inverts it, makes it negative 0.5, because this is subtracting instead of adding. So what this does is add the value from the sample mapper constantly to the altitude that you're trying to sit at. So if I bring it down far enough, now it wants to sit at 22, but the hovers are sitting at 26, and it would fly down if I wasn't sitting on the ground. Obviously the ground blocks my progress downwards. So to recap, this left side is just the balance, the left side of the balance video, and these ones around here are all just the same thing again. They're all linked up to this control, which is just a number which represents the altitude you want to sit at. That's controlled by a sample mapper, which is linked to an input sampler, so it allows you to move up and down as you please. So that's how the hovering works, and that's how you get the upward and downward motion. The jet is a simple input sample thing. There are obviously 2 jets, and what happens is one jet has a negative of A, one jet has a negative of D. So what happens is when I hold W, it goes forward. When I hit A, one of the engines turns off. When I hit D, the other engine turns off. And that is how I cause the turning, by turning off the engine that is in the direction that I want to turn. Right, I've mentioned this on the forums before. It's a good way to avoid having to use motors or elbows or anything, or fins to cause your craft to turn. You've got to be careful with it, and you need to have a fairly high attack value, because the attack value affects how much you can actually turn. The last thing, I'll go through and explain how this flux capacitor fires, how this cannon fires. Over here you got an input sampler, which of course I said was mapped to X. Once again, release an attack of 100, that makes it binary. So 1, 0, 1, 0. Right, so 0 when I'm not holding it, 1 when I am. Now we've got the toggle. Every time this receives a 1, it will swap